In the fall of 2004, a television network spent more money on a single pilot episode than almost anyone in the history of the medium had spent before. They built a real fuselage. They shipped it to a beach in Hawaii and buried half of it in the sand. They rigged working fire, working smoke, an engine that could still spin on cue. They hired more speaking roles than most dramas cast in 5 seasons combined, and they built an entire mythology under the sand without telling the audience a single piece of it up front. By every reasonable measure of network television in 2004, this was an insane bet. Serialized dramas with big ensemble casts and open-ended mysteries did not, as a rule, survive first contact with a mass audience. They confused people. They demanded patience nobody had. The safe money said this show would burn through its budget, lose viewers by week 3, once the "What is this island?" novelty wore off, and quietly vanish the way a dozen ambitious pilots vanish every year. Instead, something happened that nobody, not the network, not the writers, probably not even the cast, fully predicted. Within weeks, people who had never watched a show like this in their lives were staying up late, arguing about a hatch in the ground. Within months, people were writing down a string of 6 numbers and playing them in actual real-world lotteries, because a television show had convinced them those numbers meant something. Within a year, Lost wasn't just a hit. It was a kind of shared cultural infrastructure, something strangers could bring up at a party and instantly have something to talk about the way you'd bring up a sports team or a piece of news. So here's the real question this video wants to answer, and it's not the question you'd expect. It's not what happened in season 1. You don't need me for a recap, and if you want the character-by-character version, I've got a whole series on this channel already. The question is stranger, and I think more interesting, why this one? Hundreds of shows have opened with a mystery. Dozens have had huge casts. A handful have even had genuinely great pilots. Why did this particular 25 episodes of television in this particular year become something the entire English-speaking internet organized itself around? I don't think there's a single answer. I think there are 4, and the real trick, the thing almost nobody talks about when they explain why Lost worked, is that all 4 of them had to happen at exactly the same time, in the same season, or the whole thing falls apart. This is a spoiler-free walk through season 1, but it's not a recap. It's an autopsy of a phenomenon. Let's take it apart piece by piece. The pilot as a weapon. Every great show has to earn your attention in its first few minutes, but almost none of them try to earn it the way Lost does. Most pilots, even good ones, spend their opening stretch orienting you. They tell you who's who. They set the stakes in plain language. They want you comfortable before they ask anything difficult of you. Lost refuses to do any of that, and the refusal is the whole point. The episode opens on an eye, just an eye snapping open, filling the frame, disoriented, blinking against a bright and unfamiliar sky. There's no title card first, no 1 week earlier, no narrator setting the scene. You are given exactly as much information as the man lying on his back in that bamboo forest, which is to say, none. He doesn't know where he is, neither do you. He gets up, dazed, still wearing a torn suit, one shoe missing without explanation, and there's a dog running past him in the underbrush for reasons nobody bothers to clarify. And then he hears it, screaming in the distance, chaos, and instead of freezing or hiding, he runs toward it. That's the choice I want you to sit with for a second, because it's not obvious, and it tells you everything about how deliberately this show was built. The writers had an easier version of this scene available to them. They could have shown you the crash first, the plane breaking apart, the terror in real time, establishing the disaster clearly before cutting to its aftermath. Plenty of shows would have done exactly that because it's the safer choice. It orients the audience immediately, no confusion, stakes established up front. Lost does the opposite on purpose. It starts you after the worst has already happened, with no memory of how you got there, and it makes you run toward the wreckage blind, exactly the way its main character has to. You don't watch the disaster from a safe distance, you wake up inside it. And when the man finally breaks through the tree line onto the beach, the show does something else that's easy to miss on a casual watch, but is actually one of the smartest visual choices in the whole episode. It doesn't show you the full scale of the wreckage all at once. A lesser show cuts wide immediately, one big establishing shot, all the horror laid out for you to take in at your own pace, safely from outside the moment. Lost keeps you moving with him instead. You get pieces. A wing on fire here, a man being pulled screaming toward a still spinning engine there, someone crawling through wreckage in the background of a shot that isn't even about them. The horror accumulates the way it would if you were actually running through it, glancing in 6 directions at once, unable to process the totality of what you're looking at because your brain is only built to handle it one horrifying detail at a time. It's not spectacle for spectacle's sake, it's disorientation as a storytelling tool, and it's doing real psychological work on you in the first 90 seconds of the show. There's a physical, tactile quality to all of this that's worth dwelling on too, because it matters for everything that comes later. This was shot practically wherever possible. A real fuselage, real fire, real smoke, a real beach, getting genuinely torn up by a production crew rather than a render farm. You can feel the difference on screen even now, decades into an era where audiences have become extremely good at unconsciously detecting when something is fake. The wreckage looks like it weighs something. The fire looks like it could actually hurt you. And that groundedness turns out to be a kind of insurance policy for everything strange the show is about to ask you to believe. A story that's going to eventually introduce you to a smoke monster, a polar bear in a jungle, and a locked hatch with numbers stamped into the metal needs, somewhere in its foundation, to have proven to you that its world has weight and consequence. The pilot spends its first few minutes building exactly that kind of trust in the most physical way possible before it ever asks you to accept anything supernatural. And notice what the show doesn't do in this entire opening stretch. It doesn't explain anything to you. Nobody turns to camera. Nobody delivers a clean, tidy monologue about who they are and why they're here. There's no voiceover walking you through the situation. You learn who these people are the exact same way you'd learn it if you were actually stranded among them, by watching what they do under pressure and piecing together fragments of conversation you're not even sure you're supposed to be listening to. A woman is trying to help a man breathe. A man is barking directions with the calm of someone who does this for a living, though you don't yet know what this is. A boy is calling for his father. It's chaos with structure hidden inside it, and the show trusts you to find that structure yourself rather than handing it to you. This matters more than it might sound like it does, because it's a statement of intent that the whole rest of Season 1 is going to hold itself to. A show that respects your intelligence in its first 5 minutes earns the right to ask harder things of you later, to let a mystery sit unanswered for episodes, to trust that you'll keep track of a dozen characters without a recap card, to believe you'll stick around waiting for a hatch to open across an entire season instead of 3 episodes. None of that patience gets extended to a show that hasn't first proven it deserves it. The pilot's real job isn't to explain Lost. It's to prove Lost can be trusted with your attention. Everything else the show does across the rest of the season is spending the credit that pilot built. It's worth pausing on the sheer length of that pilot too, because it's unusual in a way that's easy to forget now. Most network dramas of the period got a single-hour introduction to establish premise, cast, and tone, and then had to start delivering a fairly conventional episode structure almost immediately. Lost's opening story stretches across a full 2 hours, split into 2 parts, and it uses that extra room the way a much more patient, novelistic piece of storytelling would, not to cram in more plot, but to let scenes breathe that a tighter runtime would have forced the writers to compress or cut. There's time for quiet character beats that don't move any mystery forward at all. People simply sitting with their shock, trying to build a fire, arguing over supplies, staring at the ocean. A lesser show, worried about losing viewers to boredom, would have rushed past those moments to get to the next plot beat. Lost sits in them, and in doing so, teaches you something important about its own rhythm before the season has barely started. This isn't a show that's going to move at the pace you might expect from network television. It's going to move at the pace the story actually needs, and if that means slowing down to watch a stranger try and fail to start a fire, that's what it's going to do. There's also a specific technical choice worth naming, because it shows up again and again across the whole season, and it starts here. The show is remarkably comfortable holding on a face in silence. Long stretches of the pilot go by with almost no dialogue at all, just reaction, just people processing something too large for words. That's a genuinely difficult thing to sustain on television, where the instinct is almost always to fill silence with explanation, and it only works because the actors and the direction have earned the trust to let a look carry as much weight as a line of dialogue would. It's a small thing technically, but it compounds. A show that can hold silence in its very first hour has given itself permission to hold silence anywhere for as long as a scene actually needs for the rest of its run. Part 2, the character engine, Everyone Has Already Lost Craft alone, doesn't make people obsess over a show for 20 years. You can build the best shot, best paced pilot in television history and still lose your audience by episode 6 if nobody on screen matters to them. So the second system Lost gets right, and honestly, I think this is the one that does the most quiet, invisible work of any of them, is how it makes an audience fall in love with an absurdly large cast of strangers in an incredibly short amount of time. If you've watched my other videos on this channel, you already know the mechanism, so I'll move through the basic shape of it quickly before I show you what it's actually doing underneath. Every episode of Season 1, without exception, splits its time between the island and a flashback to somebody's life before the crash. And the pattern those flashbacks follow is almost mathematically consistent. The island gives you a version of a person that feels settled, a first impression you're comfortable trusting, and then the flashback detonates it. Kate looks like the most reliable, capable person on that beach, brave, quick, good in a crisis, and then the flashback tells you she's a fugitive who's spent her adult life running from the law. Locke looks like an odd, unsettlingly calm older man who seems to know the jungle better than anyone has any right to. And then the flashback shows you a man who was in a wheelchair before the crash, mocked and dismissed his entire life, discovering his legs work again for the first time on this beach. Sawyer looks like the camp's resident villain, hoarding supplies while people suffer around him, and then the flashback shows you a little boy who lost both his parents to a con man's cruelty and grew up, in a kind of quiet self-punishment nobody around him understands, to become that exact kind of man himself, right down to stealing his name. That's judgment, then reversal, over and over, almost like a drumbeat running under the entire season. And once you notice the pattern, you start to realize what it's actually doing to you as a viewer, episode after episode. It's training you. It's teaching you, in the most visceral way a piece of fiction can teach anything, that your first read on a person is never the whole story, that the person you just quietly judged in your head 30 seconds ago is about to turn out to be carrying something you couldn't have guessed. By the middle of the season, you should genuinely start to distrust your own snap judgments the moment a new character walks into frame, because the show has punished that instinct so consistently that your brain adjusts on its own. That's not a coincidence. That's 42 minutes of narrative conditioning delivered one flashback at a time. And it's a big part of why so many people describe this show as having made them a little more patient with real people in their own lives. You don't get that effect from clever mystery box plotting. You get it from character work, repeated with discipline, until it becomes instinct. It's also worth pausing on how much of the cast this pattern extends to, because the video series on this channel has only had room to give the biggest names their own full breakdowns, and the show is actually far more generous than that. Saeed, the former soldier with the technical skills the group desperately needs, carries a past defined by his country's war and things he did in it that the show doesn't let him, or you, off the hook for easily. Sun and Jin, a Korean couple who can barely speak to the rest of the survivors, are hiding a marriage built on secrets and a father's cruelty that the flashbacks unpack slowly, patiently across the whole season. Charlie, the washed-up rock star, is fighting an addiction that the island doesn't remove so much as strip of its usual hiding places. Even characters who never get a full episode built around them get fragments, glimpses that suggest a whole interior life the show simply doesn't have time to fully unpack yet, but promises is there. The rule holds for almost everyone. Nobody on this beach is only what they appear to be in scene 1. There's a structural bet buried in all of this that's worth naming directly, because it's genuinely risky, and it's easy to take for granted now that we know it worked. Most dramas of this era, and honestly most dramas in general, center one or two protagonists and treat everyone else as supporting cast. That's the safer choice. It's easier to build audience loyalty around a smaller number of people, easier to write, easier to market. Lost spreads its bets across more than a dozen characters with genuine, fully developed inner lives, which is a much harder needle to thread. Get it wrong, and you end up with a show where the audience only cares about 2 or 3 people and tunes out every episode centered on someone else. Get it right, though, and you've built something with an enormous amount of long-term fuel in the tank, because every one of those characters can generate new relationships, new conflicts, new secrets to slowly reveal, essentially indefinitely, without the show ever needing to invent a brand new premise to stay interesting. A 2-lead show eventually runs out of angles on those 2 people. A 14-lead show, done well, barely scratches the surface of its own cast by the time a season ends. And there's one more thing this structure does that I think is genuinely elegant, and it's easy to miss because it's more of an absence than a presence. Notice that Lost never really forces you to see the island through one specific person's eyes. There's no single audience surrogate lens dictating how you're supposed to feel about everything. You're not locked into experiencing the mysteries strictly as Jack experiences them or strictly as Kate does. Your sympathy rotates. One week you're deep inside Sawyer's head and you understand, maybe even forgive, the cruelty you watched him hand out 3 episodes earlier. The next week you're inside Locke's history and the eerie, unsettling man from the pilot becomes the character you're rooting hardest for. That rotation mirrors something true about actually getting to know a group of strangers in real life. Your understanding of any given person keeps updating as you learn more, and nobody stays simple for long. Most shows don't bother trying to recreate that feeling. Lost builds its entire first season around it. The title of the show is doing more work here than people usually give it credit for, and once you see the pattern, it's hard to unsee. Every flashback, whatever its specific plot, is quietly telling the same underlying story. This person's real crash happened years before Oceanic 815 ever left the runway. Jack was lost in his father's shadow long before any plane went down. Kate was lost the moment she started running and never found a way to stop. Sawyer was lost inside a stolen name he built to survive his own grief. Locke was lost in a chair the world had already written him off in, chasing an approval that never came. The island doesn't create the brokenness in any of these people. It just finally puts a few dozen separately drowning strangers into the same room and forces them for the first time to actually look at each other. That's the emotional engine underneath everything else this show does, and it's the reason strangers survive a plane crash, which is on its own a pretty thin premise turned into a show people openly cried during. The plot gives you a hatch to wonder about. The characters give you a reason to care whether anyone lives long enough to see what's inside it. There's a second, quieter effect of this structure worth calling out, because it's easy to experience without ever consciously noticing it. The flashbacks don't just build sympathy for individuals, they build a strange kind of intimacy between the audience and the island itself. By the time you're a dozen episodes in, you don't just know these people's secrets, you know secrets about each other that the characters themselves don't know yet. You watch Kate lie to Jack about her past, and you're sitting there holding the truth because the show showed it to you 3 episodes earlier and never showed it to him. You watch Sawyer get accused of hoarding medicine he genuinely doesn't have, and you know exactly why he won't defend himself, and you know it has nothing to do with the medicine. That gap between what you know and what the characters know does something clever to your relationship with the show. It turns you into a kind of silent, invisible member of the camp, someone who's been let in on every confession except the ones being made out loud on the beach. Very few ensemble dramas manage that particular trick, because it requires exactly the kind of disciplined, everyone gets a turn structure Lost commits to for an entire season. It's also worth noticing how the show uses its supporting cast to widen this effect without diluting it. Take Sayid for a moment, because his flashbacks do something the show doesn't attempt with anyone else in season 1. They ask you to sympathize with a character while also refusing to soften what he actually did in his past. He was a soldier, and some of what the flashbacks show him doing in that role is genuinely difficult to watch. The show doesn't let him off easily, and it doesn't let you off easily either. That's a much harder balancing act than the Kate or Sawyer model, where the reveal mostly recontextualizes someone as more sympathetic than they first appeared. Sayid's arc asks something tougher of the audience: hold 2 true things about a person at once, the harm and the humanity, without collapsing either one into the other. The fact that the show attempts this at all, this early, in a network drama with a mass audience, says something about how much confidence it had in its own structure by the time it got to him. Sun and Jin do something different again. Their flashbacks unfold almost entirely in Korean, subtitled, on a major American network in 2004, itself a genuinely unusual choice for the era, and the story they tell is quieter and more domestic than almost anything else in the season. A marriage strained by class, by a controlling father, by secrets each of them is keeping from the other rather than from the group at large. Their arc barely touches the island's central mysteries at all for most of the season. It's pure human drama, running in parallel to the monster and the hatch and the numbers, and the fact that the show has room for a storyline this intimate, this unconnected to the plot machinery, tells you something important about its priorities. The mysteries were never the whole show. They were the frame the character work got to hang inside of. Even Charlie, whose flashbacks deal with addiction in a way that's blunt for network television of that period, gets this same patient treatment, not a redemption arc rushed through in a single episode, but a slow, uneven, often frustrating struggle that the show refuses to resolve neatly just because a season is ending. That refusal to tidy things up is itself part of the character engine's design. A show that wraps every arc in a satisfying bow by the finale is a show that stopped trusting its audience to sit with something unfinished. Lost, in season 1, mostly declines to do that, and it's part of why the ensemble feels less like a cast of characters and more like a genuine group of people you'd recognize if you met them. Part 3, the mystery architecture. So you've got a pilot that earns your trust in its opening minutes, and a character structure that makes you love people faster than you have any right to. Neither of those, on their own, explains message boards and lottery tickets. For that, you need to look at how Lost actually builds its mysteries, because there's a real design philosophy at work here, consistent enough across every single one of the season's big questions that it's worth treating as a kind of masterclass in how to make an audience unable to look away. Start with the monster, because it's the cleanest example of the show's central trick: withhold, don't reveal. For the entire first season, you never see this thing clearly. What you get instead is sound, something enormous moving through trees that shouldn't be able to move that fast. A noise that sounds like grinding metal wrapped around something closer to a living roar, and consequence. Trees get ripped bodily out of the ground. On the very first night on the island, something reaches into the cockpit and drags the plane's pilot out to his death, and the show lets you see the aftermath, the wreckage of what was done to him, without ever showing you what did it. Characters react to it with a specific, controlled kind of terror that tells you more than any visual could. The way you flinch at a scream in the dark more than you'd flinch at seeing whatever made it. This isn't an accident born of a limited effects budget, even though budget was genuinely a factor in the early going. It's a storytelling principle that goes back decades, and it's worth naming directly because Lost is working consciously inside a tradition here. The thing you imagine is always going to be more frightening and more specific to you personally than the thing a show can actually put on screen. Every viewer's brain fills that unseen monster in with whatever scares them most individually. Show it too early, in full detail, and you've replaced 1,000 different personal terrors with one single, fixed, ultimately limited visual, and once an audience has seen a thing clearly, it can never again be quite as frightening as it was in the dark. Lost understands this instinctively in season 1, and the season is disciplined enough to sit on that restraint for its entire run, which is a genuinely hard thing for a show to do once the audience starts begging for answers. The numbers work on a related but slightly different principle, and they might be the purest distillation of the show's whole mystery philosophy, so it's worth walking through exactly how they escalate. First, you get them attached to one man, Hurley, the warmest, least mysterious seeming person on the beach, wins the lottery with a set of 6 digits, 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, 42, and then watches everyone and everything around that windfall slowly fall apart, until he becomes convinced the numbers themselves are cursed. On their own, that's just one man's personal, possibly delusional belief. The show even lets other characters shrug it off as coincidence and bad luck, and it never fully closes that door. But then the same numbers turn up somewhere they have no business being, buried in a distress signal that's been looping on this island for 16 years, recorded by a woman who was never anywhere near Hurley's life. And then they turn up a third time, stamped into the metal of a sealed hatch buried in the middle of the jungle, discovered by people who have never heard Hurley's story at all. Once the same specific arbitrary string of digits shows up in 3 completely unconnected places, coincidence stops being a comfortable explanation, and your brain, which is a pattern recognition machine whether you like it or not, starts hunting for the thread connecting them, because 6 repeating digits are exactly specific enough to feel meaningful and exactly unexplained enough to resist an easy answer. That combination is close to a design formula, enough structure that your brain refuses to write it off as noise, and enough absence of explanation that it can't be resolved and set aside either. It just sits there, itching, between episodes, which is exactly where a show wants a mystery to live. It's worth pointing out just how far this particular mystery escaped the boundaries of the television screen, because it's real, measurable proof that the design worked exactly as intended. People didn't just discuss the numbers. They wrote them down and played them in actual lotteries in large enough volume that when a real-world drawing years later happened to land close to that exact sequence, thousands of real people ended up splitting a prize because of numbers they'd first seen on a scripted TV show. That's not a fandom being enthusiastic. That's a fictional mystery successfully colonizing real-world behavior, which is about as strong a signal as you can get that a piece of mystery design has done its job. Then there's the hatch, and the hatch is really a lesson in pacing more than anything else. Locke and Boone stumble across it relatively early, a heavy metal door sunk into the jungle floor, sealed, no visible way in, and the show could easily have opened it by, say, the 15th episode of a 25-episode season. That would still have felt reasonably patient by the standards of most television. Instead, the show sits on it. Locke's obsession with it builds across the entire back half of the season. The camp fractures, arguments happen over whether to even try opening it, real cost gets paid along the way in blood and trust, and the door doesn't come open until the literal final minutes of the season finale, with the reveal of what's actually down there withheld entirely for the leap into a second season. That's not stalling. That's a structural bet that the audience's patience, carefully built up over 24 episodes of trust, can be stretched across an entire summer's wait, and that the payoff of ending an entire season on an unanswered what's down there will generate more conversation, more theorizing, more must-watch urgency for the next premiere than answering it 3/4 of the way through ever could have. And what ties the monster, the numbers, and the hatch together isn't coincidence, it's a consistent philosophy the show runs across literally every mystery it introduces. Plant something strange early. Let it escalate through unexplained connections to other strange things, so the mysteries start to feel like they're all secretly wired to the same circuit even before you know how. Refuse to explain anything immediately, no matter how loudly the audience asks. And let the audience do the actual work of theorizing in the gaps between episodes for free, because that unpaid labor is exactly what turns passive viewers into an active, self-organizing audience. There's a smaller mystery worth mentioning here too, because it illustrates the same design philosophy operating at a much more intimate scale. Deep in the jungle, far from the water, the survivors stumble across the wreck of an old sailing ship. Not a plane, not modern wreckage, but a genuinely ancient vessel, sitting among the trees miles from any coastline that could plausibly have put it there. The show does something almost cheeky with this discovery. It doesn't build a multi-episode arc around it. It just lets you find it, lets the characters register just enough confusion to confirm that yes, this is exactly as impossible as you think it is, and then moves on. No answer, no follow-up scene explaining it away. It's mystery as texture rather than mystery as plot. Proof that this island's strangeness isn't limited to the handful of threads getting dedicated arcs, but is actually saturating the whole environment, whether the show has time to address it directly or not. That's a confidence move. A show less sure of its own internal coherence would feel compelled to at least gesture at an explanation. Lost in Season 1 is comfortable letting some strangeness simply exist, unexplained, as evidence that there's more going on here than any one season could possibly cover. The others function as a mystery in a completely different register from the monster or the numbers, and it's worth separating them out because the technique is distinct. Rather than an unseen force in the jungle, the others are a hidden threat inside the camp's own trust. The season slowly reveals that the survivors are being watched, and worse, that at least one of these hidden watchers has actually infiltrated the group, walking among them for episodes at a time under a false identity before anyone realizes it. That's not a what is this thing mystery, that's a who can I trust mystery, and it works on an entirely different nerve. It turns rewatching those early episodes into an unsettling exercise because you start scanning every background face and every too quiet stranger, wondering who else might not be who they claim to be. A show that can generate that specific, paranoid kind of tension, dread aimed inward at the group itself rather than outward at the jungle, is doing something genuinely sophisticated with the basic tools of a survival thriller. It's worth being precise about why pattern without explanation works as well as it does on a psychological level, because this isn't just a clever trick, it's built on something close to a law of how human attention actually functions. Our brains are, at a fundamental level, pattern recognition engines. We are extremely good at spotting structure, an extremely uncomfortable leaving structure we've spotted unresolved. A pile of random, disconnected, strange events doesn't generate obsession because there's nothing for the brain to grab onto. It just reads as noise, and noise gets tuned out. But a set of strange events that clearly rhyme with each other, the same 6 numbers surfacing in 3 unrelated places, say signals to your brain that there is a hidden structure here, a real answer waiting to be found, and that signal is almost impossible to ignore once it's been triggered. The show is, whether by instinct or design, exploiting one of the most reliable quirks of human cognition, and it's doing it with total discipline across dozens of hours of television. Which is the perfect place to talk about the infrastructure this design decision was lucky enough to land inside of. Because a mystery this well built still needs somewhere to be discussed, and in 2004, for maybe the first time in television history, that somewhere genuinely existed. Part 4, the cultural moment. Here's the thing about brilliant design. It's necessary, but on its own it's not always sufficient. You can build the most addictive mystery architecture in television history and still have it die quietly if it airs in the wrong decade, to the wrong audience, through the wrong technology. Lost's fourth advantage, and it's the one people talk about least, probably because it has nothing to do with anyone's writing talent, is that it landed at almost exactly the right moment in the history of both television and the internet to become something bigger than a TV show. Picture the network television landscape in 2004 for a second, because it's easy to forget how different it looked. Reality television was dominant and cheap, and had been eating into scripted programming's dominance for a few years running. High concept, heavily serialized dramas with mystery elements and enormous ensemble casts were not the safe bet on broadcast network television that they might look like in hindsight. They were considered a genuine gamble, precisely the kind of show that critics worried audiences wouldn't have the patience to follow week to week without a streaming catch-up option to fall back on. A show this expensive, this strange, this demanding of sustained audience attention was a real risk for a broadcast network to take, not a calculated safe play dressed up after the fact as bold. That risk is part of what made the reaction to it so explosive, because this wasn't a niche cable experiment quietly building a cult following over years. This was one of the most expensive pilots ever produced, airing on a major broadcast network, reaching a mainstream, non-niche audience all at once, the kind of audience that doesn't usually organize itself around decoding hidden numbers in a television show. And that's where the internet comes in, because the mid-2000s were a specific narrow window in the history of how people watched and discussed television. Broadband internet access was spreading fast, but had only recently become common enough that a large chunk of the country could reasonably participate in online discussion the same night an episode aired. Recap culture and dedicated fan forums were just beginning to mature into something a mass audience would actually use, rather than a niche hobby for the terminally online. There was no streaming yet in the way we understand it now, no binging a season whenever you felt like it, no algorithm serving you the show months after everyone else had already discussed it. Everyone who watched Lost watched the same episode on the same night, largely at the same time, and then went online, genuinely a novel behavior for a mass audience at that specific moment. To compare notes with strangers before anyone had really settled on what watching TV together apart was even supposed to look like. That combination is almost impossible to recreate. A show exactly this well-designed, airing 10 years earlier, wouldn't have had the internet infrastructure to support the kind of real-time, collective theorizing that turned what's in the hatch into a genuine nationwide conversation happening in forum threads and long theory documents passed around by email. A show exactly this well-designed airing 10 years later would have hit a completely different problem, a media landscape so fragmented by streaming, on-demand viewing, and 100 competing prestige dramas, doing similar mystery box tricks that it would have had to fight for attention against its own genre, rather than having that genre mostly to itself on the biggest stage in television. Lost got the narrow window in between, just enough internet to build a shared, real-time audience, and just few enough direct competitors doing exactly this kind of thing that it could feel, for a little while, like the only game in town. That's the piece that's easy to miss when people credit the writing alone for the show's success, and I think it's important to say clearly, the writing and design in parts 1 through 3 were necessary for any of this to happen, but they weren't sufficient on their own. A brilliant mystery box still needs somewhere to be opened in public. Lost's genuine hard-earned craft happened to arrive at the one moment in television history custom built to amplify it as loudly as possible. There's another piece of the cultural puzzle worth naming, and it has less to do with technology and more to do with a kind of collective appetite that happened to be building right around this exact moment. The years just before Lost premiered had already started training a mainstream audience to expect more from serialized television than the case of the week structure that had dominated for decades. Dramas that rewarded long-term attention, that punished you for missing an episode, that treated their audience as capable of tracking complex, ongoing plots rather than resetting to a blank slate every week. Lost didn't invent that appetite. But it arrived at almost the exact moment that appetite had grown large enough to support something this ambitious on a mainstream broadcast network rather than being confined to a smaller, more niche cable audience already primed for difficult, demanding storytelling. It got to be the show that took serialized, mystery-driven television and proved definitively that it could work at the largest possible scale, not for a devoted cult audience, but for tens of millions of ordinary viewers tuning into network television on a Wednesday night. It's also worth noting how unusual it was at that moment for a mystery this large to be sustained without a clear resolution in sight for years at a time. Modern audiences are used to shows announcing their total episode count and end date well in advance, which changes how people watch. There's a built-in reassurance that answers are coming on a schedule, that the mystery has been engineered with a known finish line. Lost's early audience had no such reassurance. Nobody watching that first season knew how many years this would run, or whether the writers themselves had the ending mapped out from day one, or whether this was building towards something coherent at all. That uncertainty is usually treated as a liability, and for some viewers eventually it became exactly that. But in season 1 specifically, before any of those doubts had time to calcify, that same uncertainty functioned as rocket fuel for the theorizing culture building up around the show. Nobody could simply wait for an official answer because nobody knew when or whether one was coming. So they built the answers themselves, collectively, in forum threads and long theory documents, filling the uncertainty with their own collaborative labor. A show with a known end date generates patience. A show without one, at exactly the right cultural moment, generated something closer to obsession. Part 5. What season 1 gets right. That's genuinely hard to sustain. I want to add one honest note here, and I want to be careful about exactly how I frame it, because this video is spoiler-free, and I intend to keep it that way completely. Anyone who has spent time in Lost fan communities knows that a huge amount of the ongoing conversation about this show, even decades later, centers on how well later seasons manage the exact balance that season 1 pulls off so cleanly. That's not me making a claim about quality. I'm not going to tell you what happens or how any specific mystery resolves. It's a structural observation about the genre this show belongs to, and it's worth naming, honestly rather than pretending it doesn't exist, because a channel that only ever tells you a show is flawless isn't a channel you can fully trust when it tells you a show is great. Here's the structural problem, stated as plainly and generally as I can without touching a single spoiler. A mystery box show has a kind of built-in mathematics working against it over time. Every answer a show gives closes a door. Every door closed removes one more source of that what could this mean energy that kept the audience theorizing in the first place. A show can keep opening new doors to replace the ones it closes for a while, but eventually, unless the people writing it have an unusually complete command of exactly where the whole story is headed from very early on, the rate of doors closing tends to outpace the rate of doors opening in a way that's satisfying. This isn't unique to Lost. It's close to a law of nature for the entire genre of long-running mystery television, and shows across the decades, including some made well after Lost and clearly influenced by it, have run into versions of the exact same wall. I'm going to leave that observation exactly where it is, general, structural, and spoiler-free, because it's not really this video's job to litigate the back half of the show's run. What I'll say instead, and what I actually believe, is that whatever anyone's specific feelings about later seasons turn out to be, it doesn't retroactively damage what Season 1 achieves entirely on its own terms. Season 1 is a remarkably complete, self-contained object. It has a beginning, real momentum, and an ending that works as a piece of television regardless of what comes after it. You can judge it on its own, the way you'd judge a great first act of a longer story, even if you had complicated feelings about the third, and on those terms, Season 1 of Lost is about as close to a perfect season of television as the mystery box genre has ever produced. Part 6, why all 4 pieces had to happen together. So let's bring this back together, because a video this long needs to end somewhere more unified than 4 separate essays stapled to each other. And I don't think that unity is optional. I think it's the actual answer to the question this whole video set out to ask. Go back through what we've covered and try removing any single piece, and watch how quickly the whole phenomenon stops making sense. Take away the pilot's craft. Imagine a version of this show that opens with a clumsier, more conventional first episode, one that spends its early minutes over-explaining the situation instead of trusting the audience to sit inside the confusion, and you probably don't get an audience willing to extend the patience a 25-episode mystery season demands. The trust never gets built in the first place. Take away the character engine instead, and imagine a version of Lost that keeps all of its mystery architecture, the monster, the numbers, the hatch, but populates it with a thin, flatly written cast that never earns your investment. You'd have had, at best, a moderately clever puzzle show. Puzzle shows without emotional stakes get watched once and forgotten. They don't generate the kind of grief and joy that makes people cry during television, and they don't generate the kind of loyalty that makes an audience stick around through 25 episodes waiting for a door to open. Nobody stays up until 1 in the morning theorizing about a mystery they don't care about, attached to people they don't love. Take away the mystery design and keep the craft and the characters, and you've got, and this would still be genuinely good, a well-made ensemble drama about plane crash survivors. Interesting, maybe even excellent, but not a phenomenon. Not something that colonizes real-world lottery drawings or gets discussed the next morning by people who don't normally discuss television at all. The mystery architecture is what turns good show into event, because it's the piece that gives an audience homework to do between episodes, and homework people choose to do voluntarily is one of the most powerful engagement tools television has ever discovered. And take away the cultural moment, imagine this exact pilot, this exact cast, this exact mystery design, airing in 1994 before broadband and forums existed to catch it, or airing in 2014 into a media landscape so fragmented and saturated with imitators that it would have had to fight tooth and nail just to be noticed, and I genuinely don't think you get the same outcome either. You might still get a good show. You don't get thousands of strangers splitting a lottery jackpot because of numbers they memorized from a television program. That's the real answer, and it's less tidy than any single explanation, but I think it's the honest one. Lost didn't become impossible to ignore because of one genius decision. It became impossible to ignore because 4 separate, genuinely difficult things, flawless pilot craft, a character structure disciplined enough to make you love a dozen strangers fast, a mystery architecture built on a real and specific design philosophy, and a cultural and technological moment perfectly shaped to amplify all of it, happened to line up in the same 6 weeks of television, which is an alignment that almost never happens for any show in any era. Think back to that image from the start of this video, a real fuselage buried in real sand on a real beach, built at a cost that made network executives nervous. By the time this video is over, I hope that image means something a little different to you than it did at the start. That wreckage wasn't just an expensive special effect. It was the physical proof of a bet the whole show was making, over and over, at every level, that an audience would trust something built with this much care, this much patience, and this much respect for their intelligence. For 1 season at least, that bet paid off completely. Outro, that's season 1, not as a plot summary, but as a machine, and hopefully you can see now why so many of its individual pieces work as well as they do. If any of the threads I touched on here made you want a deeper dive, this channel has full breakdowns of Jack, Kate, Locke, Sawyer, and Boone and Shannon, plus a closer look at the flashback structure and the numbers specifically, so pull on whichever one you're curious about. I'll leave you with the same question the video's been circling the whole way through, of the 4 pillars, the craft, the characters, the mysteries, or the moment it landed in, which one do you think actually mattered most? I genuinely don't think there's one right answer, and I'd love to see the argument play out in the comments. If you want more of these, subscribing genuinely helps a channel this size keep going. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of this one. I know it was a long trip. I'll see you on the island.